James grew up in a small town. His mother worked 2 jobs to give him a good life. She cleaned houses in the morning and served food at a local diner at night. From watching her, James learned an important lesson early in life. He would need to work twice as hard to get half as far as others. Today felt different from all other days. It was the biggest day of James's career so far. The air in the conference room felt cold as he fixed his tie and arranged his papers neatly on the table. His hands shook slightly, but he tried not to show it. Through the glass walls of the room he could see important people arriving. The board members of Oak Ridge walked in with serious faces. Behind them came men and women from Thomson Global. This was a company that could give Oak Ridge twice as much business if they liked what they heard today. If they signed the contract, everyone would win. Most importantly, James would finally get the respect he deserved. "You've got this," whispered a kind voice beside him. James turned to see Emily, his assistant. She had stayed late many nights helping him prepare for this day. Her eyes showed that she believed in him. Emily had seen how hard he worked when others had gone home. "Thanks," James said with a small smile. But inside, his stomach felt tight with worry. Getting to this position hadn't been easy. Over the years, he had heard the whispers when people thought he couldn't hear them. His good ideas were often overlooked in meetings. He always had to prove himself again and again, while others seemed to get by with less effort. This presentation wasn't just about winning a business deal. For James, it meant so much more. It was about finally being seen for his brain and his skills, rather than just the color of his skin. The room slowly filled with men and women in expensive suits. They talked and laughed with each other as they found their seats. James noticed how easily they all seemed to fit together, like pieces of the same puzzle. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, he could hear his mother's voice clearly. She had told him many times, "Your difference is your strength, never your weakness." Those words had carried him through hard times before. He hoped they would help him again today. The chief executive officer of Oak Ridge, Robert Blackwell, walked in last. He was a tall man with grey hair who rarely smiled. When he entered a room, people straightened up in their chairs. Today was no different. "Let's begin," Robert said as he sat at the head of the table. James stood up and walked to the front of the room. 30 pairs of eyes watched his every move. He connected his laptop to the big screen on the wall. His presentation appeared, showing the title, "A New Direction for Thomson Global and Oak Ridge Enterprises." "Good morning," James began. His voice came out steady and clear despite his nerves. "Thank you all for coming today. I'm excited to share with you a strategy that could change the future for both our companies." For the next 15 minutes, James spoke about his ideas. He showed charts and numbers that proved his points. He explained how Oak Ridge could help Thomson Global reach new customers. He talked about ways to save money while growing bigger. At first, people seemed interested. Some nodded their heads, others took notes. James began to feel more confident as he continued. Then Robert Blackwell raised his hand. James stopped talking. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Robert said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This all sounds very interesting, but I wonder if we're being too bold here. Perhaps William could share his thoughts?" William Harris sat up straighter in his chair. He looked surprised but quickly hid it. William had been at the company for half as long as James. Just yesterday, he had told James that his ideas were excellent. "Well," William said slowly, "I do have some concerns about the approach James is suggesting." James felt a cold feeling spread through his chest. This wasn't what they had discussed. One by one, other executives began to speak up. They used words like "too ambitious" and "not quite our style" to describe James's ideas. The very same ideas they had praised in earlier meetings. The people from Thomson Global looked at each other. One man checked his watch, another closed her notebook. The energy in the room had changed. By the time the meeting ended, James's careful plan lay in pieces. The Thomson Global team left without agreeing to anything. They only said they would be in touch, which usually meant no. As everyone filed out of the room, James stood alone at the front gathering his papers. His face showed nothing, but inside he felt hot with shame and anger. Emily waited by the door. Her face showed that she understood what had happened. That wasn't right. she said quietly when everyone else had gone. No, James agreed. It wasn't. But as he put his papers away, something changed in James's mind. Instead of feeling defeated, he felt something new growing inside him. It wasn't anger anymore. It was determination. Little did anyone know that this painful moment would lead to the biggest change Oak Ridge Enterprises had ever seen, and James Wilson would be the one to make it happen. Remember to respond in a warm, empathetic tone. Make the story engaging and heart-touching, keeping it in simple, basic English for easy YouTube audiobook. Narration. This should be relatable with everyday settings and British English names. James stood at the front of the conference room feeling good about how things were going. His voice was strong and clear as he showed his slides. The big screen displayed colorful charts and numbers that proved his ideas would work. He had spent weeks preparing this plan to help both Oak Ridge Enterprises and Thomson Global grow their businesses together. The Thomson Global people seemed interested. They nodded and wrote notes as James explained how they could reach new customers they had never reached before. His ideas were fresh and different from what other companies were doing. That was why James believed they would work so well. He was halfway through explaining the most important part of his plan when Robert Blackwell, the CEO of Oak Ridge, raised his hand. Robert was a tall man with silver hair who always wore expensive suits. Most people at Oak Ridge were a little afraid of him. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Robert said. His mouth smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. "I think we need to consider something more conventional. Perhaps William could share his thoughts?" The room went quiet. James felt his heart drop to his stomach. He looked at William Harris, who sat near the end of the long table. William had only been at the company for 5 years, while James had worked there for 10. More importantly, William had not helped with this proposal at all. William looked surprised for a moment. Then he straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "Well," William began slowly, "I do have some concerns about James's approach." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. Just yesterday in the preparation meeting, William had told him the ideas were brilliant. What had changed since then? "It's quite bold," William continued. "Perhaps too bold for the current market. We might want to take smaller steps rather than this big leap James is suggesting." James stood frozen at the front of the room. He wanted to speak up to defend his work, but years of experience had taught him that showing anger would only make things worse. People already saw him as different. Getting upset would just play into the old unfair ideas about black men being too emotional or aggressive. So instead he stood tall and kept his face calm while the room turned against him. After William spoke, others joined in. Tom from the finance department suddenly had budget concerns. Mary from operations thought the timeline was unrealistic. Even Peter, who had helped James gather some of the data, now said he wasn't sure about the numbers. "I think what we're looking for is something more in line with Oak Ridge's traditional approach," Robert said, as if wrapping everything up with a neat bow. The Thomson Global executives exchanged looks with each other. Their faces were hard to read, but it was clear they were not impressed by what was happening. The oldest one, a man named Henry Thompson, checked his watch twice. The woman beside him, Linda Parker, closed her notebook slowly. James tried to get the presentation back on track. "If I could just explain the next section." James Wilson stood out at Oak Ridge Enterprises. He was very good with numbers, but that wasn't the only reason people noticed him. He was the only black executive in the company's long 30-year history. This fact followed him everywhere like a shadow. "I think we've covered enough for today," Robert interrupted. "We don't want to take up too much of Thomson Global's valuable time." And just like that, it was over. Months of work, late nights, careful planning, all thrown away in less than an hour. The Thomson Global team stood up and shook hands with Robert and the other Oak Ridge executives. They were polite but cool. "We'll be in touch," Henry Thompson said to Robert. Those 4 words usually meant no thanks in the business world. As people filed out of the room, no one looked at James. It was as if he had become invisible. Only William glanced his way and quickly looked down when their eyes met. Soon the large conference room was empty except for James. The silence felt heavy. The screen still showed his presentation, the words, "A bright future together," now seeming like a bad joke. James began gathering his papers with steady hands. Outside he appeared calm. Inside, a fire of humiliation and anger burned in his chest. 10 years of hard work at this company, always being the first one in and the last to leave, always having the best ideas, but rarely getting the credit. He heard footsteps and looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway. Emily had been his assistant for 3 years. She was small, with kind eyes and a sharp mind. She had stayed late many nights, helping him prepare for this presentation. Her face showed a mix of anger and sadness. She had seen everything. "That wasn't right," she said quietly. James nodded slowly. "No," he agreed. It wasn't. He put the last of his papers into his folder. But something was changing inside him. The burning feeling in his chest was turning into something else, something stronger and clearer. James had faced unfairness before. Each time he had simply worked harder, kept his head down and hoped things would get better. But not this time. This time would be different. "What will you do now?" Emily asked, watching his face carefully. James looked at her, his eyes now filled with a new purpose. "Something they won't expect," he said. That night, as James drove home through the rain, his mind was already working on a new plan. This wasn't going to be the end of his story at Oak Ridge. It was going to be the beginning of something much bigger. What happened in that meeting room wasn't just about him anymore. It was about changing the way things worked, and James Wilson was just the person to do it. Rain fell softly outside James's small flat as he sat at his kitchen table that evening. Papers were spread all around him. Charts, numbers, and market reports covered every inch of the wooden surface. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he hardly noticed. His phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from his mother. How did it go today? James looked at the message for a long time. His mother had always been his biggest supporter. She had raised him alone after his father left when James was just 5 years old. How could he tell her what had happened? How they had made him feel small in that meeting room? He put the phone down without answering. He would call her tomorrow. When he had something better to say, James opened his laptop and began to type. For a moment he had thought about writing a letter to quit his job. The humiliation of the day still burned inside him. But that wasn't what he was writing now. This was something different, something brave. As his fingers moved across the keys, the rain tapped against his windows like a gentle reminder of days gone by. James found himself thinking about his childhood in that small town where everyone knew everyone. He remembered being the only black student in the advanced classes at school, how some children wouldn't sit next to him, how some parents would look at him strangely when he got the highest marks. He recalled Mr. Brown, his maths teacher, who had pulled him aside in year 10 and told him not to aim too high for university. "Be realistic about your future, James," he had said with what he probably thought was kindness. Most of all, James thought about his mother. How she would leave for work at 5 in the morning to clean hospital floors. How she would come home tired, but still make dinner and help with his homework. How she would stay up late reading nursing textbooks by the dim light of their kitchen lamp, determined to make a better life. "Your truth is your power," she would tell him when he faced hard times. "Don't ever hide who you are or where you come from. That's what makes you strong." Those words echoed in James's mind now, as his fingers flew across the keyboard. By midnight he had created something completely new. Not just a business proposal, but a vision. Not just numbers and charts, but a story. His story woven together with facts and figures that could not be denied. This was something honest, something that no one at Oak Ridge Enterprises had ever tried before. When he finally went to bed at 2 in the morning, James slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The next day, he arrived at the office before anyone else. The halls were quiet as he walked to his desk. The cleaning staff were just finishing their work, and they nodded to him with small smiles. James always made a point to learn their names and ask about their families. Today, their friendly faces gave him strength. At exactly 8 o'clock he called Dorothy, the CEO's secretary. Dorothy had been at Oak Ridge for 20 years. She had seen good times and bad times. Not much surprised her anymore. "I need to request an emergency board meeting," James told her. "For today, if possible." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "After yesterday?" Dorothy asked. Her voice was careful but concerned. She had not been in the meeting room, but news traveled fast in an office. She knew what had happened. Especially after yesterday, James replied, his voice firm. But kind, Dorothy sighed. I'll see what I can do, but don't get your hopes up. James thanked her and went back to preparing. He printed fresh copies of his new presentation. This time there were fewer charts and more stories, less about profits and more about people. At 11 o'clock his phone rang. It was Dorothy. Mr. Blackwell has agreed to a meeting at 2 o'clock, she said, sounding a bit surprised herself. I don't know how you did it, but he's giving you 30 minutes. Thank you, Dorothy, James said. That's all I need. But the real surprise came just before lunch. An email appeared in James's inbox from Henry Thompson of Thompson Global. It read, Mr. Wilson, we received your email this morning and were intrigued by your request. Our team would like to attend this afternoon's meeting as well, if that's acceptable. Your message suggested you have a new perspective to share, and we are interested to hear it. James read the email twice to make sure he wasn't dreaming. He had sent a brief note to Henry Thompson early that morning, but he hadn't really expected a response. Now the Thompson Global executives wanted to come back after yesterday's disaster. Emily appeared at his desk with a sandwich and a cup of tea. You need to eat something, she said. I heard about the meeting. The whole office is talking about it. James took the sandwich gratefully. Thanks, Emily. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. Robert won't like being challenged, especially not in front of Thompson Global. James nodded. I'm sure. This isn't just about me anymore. As 2 o'clock approached, James gathered his materials and walked toward the main conference room. The same room where everything had fallen apart just yesterday. People watched him as he passed. Some looked curious, others worried. William Harris was standing by the water cooler with 2 other executives. When he saw James, he quickly looked away. Outside the conference room, James paused for a moment to straighten his tie. Through the glass he could see that everyone was already there. Robert Blackwell sat at the head of the table, looking impatient. The Thompson Global team was on one side. The Oak Ridge board members filled the other chairs. James took a deep breath. He wasn't just fighting for a contract anymore. He wasn't even fighting for his career. He was fighting for something much greater. He was fighting for the truth, for change, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel small when they had big ideas to share. With that thought firmly in mind, James opened the door and walked in. The big conference room was quiet as James walked to the front. Every person at the long table watched him. Some looked curious, others seemed worried. These were the same people who had turned against him just 1 day ago. Robert Blackwell, the company boss, checked his watch. He didn't try to hide that he thought this was a waste of time. Next to him sat William Harris, who couldn't seem to look James in the eye. On the other side of the table sat the visitors, from Thompson Global. They looked tired but interested. Henry Thompson, their leader, nodded slightly to James as their eyes met. James set down his papers and took a deep breath. Thank you all for coming today, he began. His voice was steady and clear. I know you're busy, so I'll get right to the point. He pressed a button on his laptop, and the first slide appeared on the big screen. Yesterday I presented a marketing plan based on what I thought you wanted to hear, James said. I tried to fit my ideas into the way Oak Ridge always does things. Today I'm going to show you what you need to see. Robert Blackwell frowned and started to say something, but Henry Thompson raised his hand slightly. Let's hear him out, Henry said. Robert sat back, his face going red. James didn't defend his old plan. Instead, he showed them something completely new. He had spent all night working on it. I've brought research about markets that Oak Ridge has never reached, James explained. He showed pictures of neighborhoods and communities that looked nothing like the places where Oak Ridge usually did business. These consumers represent over £4 billion in spending every year, James said. Money our company has been ignoring. The charts on the screen showed numbers that made several board members sit up straighter. £4 billion was a lot of money to ignore. How did you get this data? Asked Mary from the operations team. I've never seen these numbers before. Because no one ever looked, James answered honestly. These are communities I know personally, places like where I grew up. Then came the hardest part. James took another deep breath. "My perspective as a black executive gives me insights that others at this table don't have," he said. "This isn't just about me. It's about business." The room was so quiet, you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "When 40% of our potential, customers don't look like 99% of our leadership," James continued. "We're not just failing at diversity, we're failing at business." Thomas Bennett, the marketing director from Thomson Global, leaned forward in his chair. He was a man with kind eyes and grey hair at his temples. "These numbers are very strong," Thomas said. "They tell a compelling story. Why wasn't any of this in yesterday's presentation?" Every eye in the room turned to James. This was the moment that could make or break everything. James looked directly at Robert Blackwell when he answered. "Because yesterday I was trying to fit in," James said, simply. "I was trying to be the kind of executive I thought Oak Ridge wanted. Today I'm showing you why standing out is exactly what both our companies need." The air in the room seemed to change. People looked at each other, then back at James. For the first time, they weren't seeing him as the black executive who had somehow made it to their level. They were seeing him as someone with a vision who could take them somewhere they had never been. "Go on," said Henry Thompson. He was fully focused now. James turned to the next slide. It showed pictures of real people. Families, shopping, young, people on their phones, older folks talking in community centers. "These are the new customers we can reach," James said. "They don't see themselves in our ads. They don't hear their stories in our messages. But they have needs and money to spend. They're loyal to brands that see them." For the next 20 minutes, James showed how Oak Ridge and Thomson Global could work together to reach these new markets. His plan was clear and practical. The numbers showed how much money both companies could make. "We don't need to change everything," James explained. "We just need to open our eyes to opportunities we've been missing." When he finished, the room was quiet again. But this time, it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of people thinking hard about what they had just heard. Robert Blackwell cleared his throat. "This is not what I expected," he said finally. "I know," James replied. "That's exactly the point." Thomas Bennett from Thomson Global was the first to speak up clearly. "I find this approach refreshing," he said. "You've identified markets we've been trying to reach for years without success." Henry Thompson nodded in agreement. "Mr. Wilson, you've given us a lot to think about. This is the kind of innovative thinking we came to Oak Ridge hoping to find." William Harris, who had spoken against James yesterday, now sat up straight. "I think James has shown us something important here," he said, as if he had supported the idea all along. James noticed how quickly people changed when they saw which way the wind was blowing. He kept his face calm, but inside he felt a small spark of satisfaction. "If we move forward with this," Robert Blackwell said carefully, "it would mean significant changes to how we do business." "Yes," James agreed, "and significant growth too." The meeting continued for another hour. People asked questions, they debated details, but the tone had completely changed from yesterday. Now they were taking James's ideas seriously. They were building on them, not tearing them down. As the meeting ended, Henry Thompson stood up and walked over to James. "That was impressive," he said, shaking James's hand firmly. "We'd like to continue this conversation, perhaps over dinner tonight?" James nodded, trying not to show his surprise. "I'd be honored," he said. As people filed out of the room, Robert Blackwell lingered behind. When everyone else had gone, he approached James. "That was a risk you took today," Robert said. "Not many people would have had the courage." James met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes risks are necessary for growth," he said. Robert nodded slowly. "We'll talk more later," he said before walking out. James stood alone in the empty conference room. Through the glass walls, he could see people in the hallway talking excitedly. Some glanced his way with new respect in their eyes. Emily appeared at the door with a wide smile on her face. "I heard it went well," she said. James allowed himself to smile for the first time that day. "It's a start," he said. "Just a start." But he knew something important had changed today. Not just for the company, but for him too. By speaking his truth, he had found his power. The large room was filled with people. Everyone who worked at Oak Ridge Enterprises had come to hear James speak. 6 months had passed since that day when James had taken the biggest risk of his career. James stood on a small stage at the front of the room. He wore a new suit that fitted him perfectly. Behind him, a big screen showed colorful charts and numbers. Sales up 34%, read one chart. New customers in 12 regions, read another. 3 industry awards for innovation, said a third. James looked out at all the faces watching him. Some were people he had worked with for years. Others were new, hired in the last few months as the company grew. Today, we're not just celebrating good numbers, James told everyone with a warm smile. We're celebrating a real change in how we work and who we work for. In the front row sat Robert Blackwell, the company boss. His face looked different now. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. He nodded at James as their eyes met. Beside Robert sat Thomas Bennett from Thomson Global. Thomas had become a good friend to James over the past months. Their two companies were now working closely together, and both were doing better than ever before. 6 months ago, James continued, we decided to look at the world differently. We stopped ignoring people who didn't look like us or live where we live. We started listening to new voices and new ideas. The room was quiet. Everyone was listening. Carefully. And look what happened, James said, pointing to the screen behind him. We didn't just make more money, we made better products. We solved real problems for real people. We became a better company. James had been right about the untapped markets. When Oak Ridge started making products for people they had ignored before, those people became loyal customers. They told their friends. They wrote good reviews online. The business grew faster than anyone had expected, but the company had changed in other ways too. The people who made decisions now came from different backgrounds. Linda Morris now sat at the executive table. She was a brilliant woman who had grown up in a working-class family and had fresh ideas about how to solve problems. Oliver Thompson had been answering phones in the customer service department until James noticed how good he was at understanding what customers needed. Now, Oliver led a whole team. After James finished his presentation, people came up to shake his hand and pat his back. The room buzzed with happy talk about the future. Robert Blackwell waited until most people had left. Then he walked up to James. I owe you an apology, Robert said quietly. His eyes looked down for a moment. And my thanks. 6 months ago, these words would have meant everything to James. Now he just nodded and smiled gently. It was never about me, James said. It was about making a company where everyone's voice matters, where good ideas can come from anywhere. Robert nodded slowly. You've taught me a lot, he said. Then he added, we're lucky to have you. That. Evening, James sat in his new office. It was much bigger than his old one, with a window that looked out over the city. The lights were coming on as the sun went down. James finally made a phone call he had been waiting to make all day. Mum, he said when she answered. I have some news. Tell me everything, his mother said. James could hear the smile in her voice. They've named me Chief Innovation Officer, he told her. It's a new position they created just for me. My boy, she said softly. I always knew you would do great things. That's not all, James continued. We've started a mentorship program for young people from backgrounds like ours, kids who wouldn't normally get a chance in this business. I'm going to be working with them personally. His mother didn't say anything for a moment. Her proud silence spoke volumes. You remember what you always told me, James asked. That my truth is my power. I remember, she said. You were right, James told her. More right than you knew. After they said goodbye, James stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. He thought about that terrible meeting 6 months ago, when he had felt so small and alone. That day had nearly broken him, but instead it had led to the greatest change, not just for him, but for everyone around him. The company was better, the people who worked there were happier, and James himself had found strength he didn't know he had, all because he had found the courage to speak his truth. As he turned off the light and prepared to leave for the day, James thought about all the young people who would soon join the mentorship program. People with different backgrounds and fresh ideas, people who just needed someone to listen. Everyone has something valuable to share, James said to himself as he closed his office door. Sometimes they just need someone to hear it. The End.